to kick off our session today, we have the very awesome Jonathan Fox here. Jonathan, I'm going to give the quick 5-second bio on you, and then I'll ask you to jump in and fill in the gaps. So, Jonathan is a technical architect, architect group co-leader, Golden Hoodie recipient, multiple Dreamforce speaker, including upcoming Dreamforce. We will be giving a version of this talk. A veteran. Thank you for your service. And 30 plus certified Salesforce and AWS certified professional. Jonathan, what did I miss?
No, that's quite the intro. Thank you. I appreciate that. It's very kind of you. Yeah, absolutely. Let me go ahead and share my screen, and then, I don't think you've missed anything there. In fact, it was very kind of you, so I appreciate that. Yeah, so I'm absolutely, I'm already skipping my slides because I'm going to say the typical Salesforce thank you bit now, because I am incredibly grateful for you inviting me along here today. Absolute pleasure to be talking to another architect group. And yeah, like you said, I just actually co-founded, well, no, actually, no, I co-founded a different group way back when, but now I've just founded the Sheffield Architect Group. And it's nice to see other architect groups doing their thing. We're very small. There's only a couple of us, so it's hard to get off the ground. So it's nice to see how you guys are all doing it. But yeah, talking about the Pub Sub API today. And Brian, as you mentioned, yeah, this was actually a very similar talk to this one, is what I did at Dreamforce 2 years ago. Able to actually talk about it today because not a huge amount has changed in terms of Pub Sub API, apart from a new beta feature, which is going to be my talk this year at Dreamforce. And I'll allude to it. I'll talk to it a little bit on today's session because I can't help myself, and it's good fun to talk about it. You've already done my intro and said thank you. So what do I want to cover today? So I want to talk about the PubSub API, and really I want to say, like, what is the PubSub API as well? Because there are still people, and we were talking about it at the beginning, that still use Comet D in the streaming API in general. There are still architects out there building solutions, or designing solutions, should I say, who still don't feel comfortable with the whole event-driven architecture side of things. And that's absolutely fine because, some organizations it doesn't fit. And that's also fine because sometimes you don't have the opportunity to get comfortable with it. So understanding what the PubSub API does will hopefully give you that opportunity to be a bit more comfortable with the API itself, and then start being able to fit it in and weave it into your designs and your solutions, obviously where applicable. We don't want to just do it for the sake of it. But what that involves is, and it might be teaching most people, if not everyone on here, how to suck eggs, but hopefully, I don't want to just take that for granted. Setting up your Salesforce org, we'll have a look at that. Simply setting up change data capture events or platform events. It's some people still haven't had the opportunity to use it, especially if you're an architect in a small organization and you found yourself not, playing with these sort of things. You've not needed to. So, it's still a key part of it. We'll have a look at Postman, because Postman is the best thing to use to get started with this sort of thing. And then I'll look into compare the Postman ways of working with a Python application that I've built to subscribe to the PubSub API. And then we'll just have a quick look at a demo and actually see it in action. Cool. So, I should have said at the beginning, by the way, any questions throughout, just stick your hand up or come off mute or video or whatever, and I'm more than happy to take questions. Collaborative, kind of free talking backwards and forwards throughout this. It's dead relaxed. I hope that's okay.
Yeah, and folks can feel free to drop questions in the chat as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, this is so kind of like chilled, and I want to keep it that way because it's collaborative. It's easygoing, especially on I suppose it's Tuesday morning, Tuesday afternoon for you guys. What time is it?
On the
Tuesday
East
evening
Coast,
for me.
we just passed. It's 12:09.
Oh wow! So I mean, the fact that you're even on at this time is fantastic. So thank you. Cool. So PubSub API. What actually is the PubSub API? Called out a couple of blue words there to highlight what it is. gRPC. So that's the mechanism that it uses. The PubSub API uses. It was originally created by Google, and Google used it to build microservices internally to start with before they became a standard that was used externally. And the benefits of it and why it's different from the streaming API, or why it's different from just, hitting a REST endpoint is, well, for a start, it uses the protobuf messaging format, and we'll get onto that in a minute, what that means. But what it actually gives us is 7 to 10 times faster message transfer than a REST API, which, I mean, in itself, when you're thinking about real-time events and data transfer, which is why we typically go down the event-driven architecture route, 7 to 10 times faster is an absolute benefit straight away. PubSub API and gRPC in general, not just the Salesforce PubSub API, but gRPC in general, supports officially, obviously there's a lot more others out there, supports officially 11 languages, or it did when I last looked. Python, Node.js, Java, to name a few. If you build an enterprise applications, you're pretty much going to be sorted, and you're going to be supported when using this API anyway. But one of the beauties of gRPC and why the PubSub API adopts it is because it's bi-directional streaming. And that means that in the same connection, you can do a publish and a subscribe. And we'll look at why that's really important in a minute. And as I've already said and alluded to, it doesn't use Comet D. So breaking that down, because there was a couple of buzzwords there and what that actually means, gRPC. So gRPC is Google Remote Procedure Call. It's a standard that Google developed, and it allows faster time to market, basically, because of how transparent it is in terms of how it works. And when it comes to developers producing the clients, the actual client, the application themselves, it's cross-functional. And that's because we use something called a protocol buffer, the protobuf. And that interface description language is one, really, really flexible. So it handles authentication as well as the bidirectional streaming, but it's cross-platform and it's cross-language. Like we've just mentioned, it's supported on 11 languages. You don't have to worry about this being, this being built in Java and then something else in your organization being built in Python. Comparing it to the streaming API, it's a single interface. And I've got like a slide in a minute where we look at the streaming API versus the PubSub API side by side. It's a single interface to do the publish, the subscribe, the getting the schema of your events. It's all on that same API. I mean, straight away for a developer in your organization, for maintenance, for updates, for reusability, straight away, the fact that you're using one interface for everything makes it so much easier for your organization to maintain this application that you've built and be able to debug it, to get it to market, everything else. So the fact it uses a single interface is a godsend, not just for developers, but for your organization as a whole. And then the Apache Avro, that's the way that these events are, when they're published, they're encoded. These payloads are encoded in this schema. Doesn't really mean much to most people, but what it does mean is because the data serialization is in this format, it's faster to serialize, it's faster to deserialize, and it's much smaller. So your payloads are smaller, the data transfer is quicker. That's where you get the 7 to 10 times quicker transfer of data. So overall, this whole kind of concept of the PubSub API using this remote procedure call offers loads of benefits in comparison and on top of the standard streaming API and having to use lots of different APIs to make it work.
Jonathan, when you do probably not a question for now, but when you do the demo and you show your Python client, can you kind of call out, like, I've definitely heard a bunch of times the sort of the value of the single interface for publishing and subscribing versus the old model. But if possible, if you can kind of call out, like, for a developer, like how that's actually beneficial for them as opposed to making different calls.
Yeah, I mean, we're also, I mean, as architects, we get asked quite a lot the technical sort of stuff as well. Even if you're a solution architect, you still get asked the technical side of things, because as an architect, you get tokenized as that person who knows everything about the platform, regardless whether you're technical, solution, or whatever, anything in between. when it comes to something like this, I guess it's also thinking about if you think about some of the well-architected principles and pillars, let's think of some like modulability, reusability of your components and what you build. Straight away, that's one of your architectural principles, is to make things reusable where possible. Build it once, reuse it lots of times, make it an interface that can be extended. This is one of those examples where you're using a single interface, you're using a single API, makes it much easier to do that sort of thing. So making that architectural decision, or at least guiding your developers down this route to use this rather than the streaming API, you've already got some like architectural idea over the top of why they might want to do it technically. Again, the speed. So speed sometimes plays into availability and reliability, especially when it comes into, back into the well-architected principles again. So you're thinking about availability of this API compared to the streaming API, which eventually will probably be deprecated fully when it's no longer absolutely needed or supported. So this has a future proof to it as well when you're thinking about your architectural designs. There's all these kind of things that, not just from a developer's lens, you pull it out one step higher and you start thinking about how it works in your solution going forward as well. So PubSub API, what does it support? It supports your high volume platform events. You change data capture and your real-time event monitoring. That's pretty much all your events on the Salesforce platform today. Some orgs may still use things like generic events and topics and things like that. Not really much anymore. And obviously the only way you can get them is through the streaming API in the comment day application. And these three types of events are really where you get the most value, and you can do pretty much everything with them anyway. If you go and have a look at the real-time event monitoring and the real-time events, standard events, Salesforce platform events, there's so many now about actions that take place on the Salesforce platform and things that you can subscribe to see what's going on in your org. Near enough every action and every interaction on the Salesforce platform now is published as an event, if you've obviously got the correct licenses and subscriptions and things like that. So it means that realistically, whatever goes on in your Salesforce org, you can send to your external applications and capture and monitor, because this isn't just about thinking about, I don't know, the typical example of why you might want to use a PubSub API. You've got an order management system external to Salesforce, and an order is changed on the Salesforce platform, change data capture, fire the event. You want that data to go to your order management system. That's the typical what people start talking about when they give an example of what to use the PubSub API for, an event architecture in general. It's like the go-to kind of scenario. But realistically, I think it's evolved much more than that, because when we're building our solutions on Salesforce, you now need to think about things, because of it being so complex and powerful, things like monitoring and alarms. And a really good example of that is at the organization I work for today. They want to track people using the mobile application, the Salesforce mobile application. They want to see the policies that are evaluated, and if anyone is triggering jailbreak detection or man-in-the-middle attacks. And if they get so many within a certain time frame, they want to trigger an alarm. That's not your typical sending order data from Salesforce to an order management system. That's a monitoring, proactive monitoring and reactive monitoring and alarms and things like that. So there's much more to think about, broaden that kind of use case to why you might want to use a PubSub API and events in general off the platform. So yeah, PubSub API supports those three types of events.
Jonathan, Art just dropped a
Yeah.
question in the chat about confirming that you need Shield to have real-time event monitoring.
So I think, yes, for real-time event monitoring, there are a lot of other events though, and I'll pull it up in a second when I go into the demo bit and come out of the deck. There is a bunch of supported platform events as well, like standard platform events that I don't think you necessarily need Shield for, but I might be wrong. So there are still like a bunch of events that you can subscribe to and make use of as well. So most of you are probably aware of this already and how the event structure works on Salesforce. You've got the Salesforce event bus and all those standard events that Salesforce has publishes to the event bus. All the platform events that you decide to publish in Apex or Flows go to the event bus, or REST APIs, whatever, if you call them from outside of Salesforce. And change data capture, obviously, the event bus. Nothing's changing here. And this probably goes back to what Brian, we were talking about at the beginning. If you've got Apex subscribing to platform events through a trigger, you've got flows listening to platform events, or you've got Lightning Web Components using the EMP API, and you've got Comet D application clients using the streaming API. None of them will break because the PubSub API isn't something different. The event bus is still the underlying technology, the underlying kind of channel that's working here with all these events. Those things that you've built today will work absolutely fine for now anyway. At least with Comet D and streaming API, there's nothing said it's end of life. It's just not getting updates to it. So everything will work fine. And that's because it's still this event bus underneath that gets the events published to, and whatever's subscribed to it gets the events. The PubSub API is no different. The PubSub API connects to the same event bus. You subscribe through the PubSub API, or now you publish through the PubSub API, and it will go to the event bus. The difference there is obviously you can publish through the same API. You can't publish through the streaming API. You'd have to publish through a Salesforce REST API. And that's the difference between why the PubSub API is slightly different. And that leads us on to, before I actually come out of this deck now and go into the kind of hands-on bit of this, is the side-by-side of the PubSub API and the streaming API. And there are some immediate benefits of the PubSub API, apart from what I've already talked about, you know, the speed and the way it's the encode and things like that, that the PubSub API has today. And that's without what I'm going to talk about at Dreamforce this year about the managed subscriptions that it has over the streaming API to start with. So a really cool thing that the PubSub API has that allows you to really control and react to how your external application works is subscription flow control, which the streaming API doesn't have. In the PubSub API, when you connect to it, you can tell the PubSub API how many events you want to receive in a go. So, for example, if it's like a really high volume event, and again, I'm going to go, because this is going to be part of the demo in a minute anyway, we have Mobile Publisher in our organization. So Mobile Publisher is a way to get a mobile app on the app stores, Google and Apple app stores, and it basically is a wrapper for an Experience Cloud site. And what it actually has is the ability to use mobile security policies, which you can basically detect if someone's on a jailbroken device, they're experiencing a man-in-the-middle attack. You can control the minimum OS version, all these kind of things, which is really cool, especially for a financial services organization where we want to be really strict about who uses our mobile app. And every time they open the app, Salesforce evaluates the mobile security policies. And every time those mobile security policies are evaluated, it publishes an event to the event bus. Now, we have currently signed up 90,000 clients, and we're hoping to have 200,000 by the end of the year. We're migrating them off an old platform. Now, if they all open the app at the same time, so for maybe I don't know, the annual wealth statement is published and they all want to go onto the app and go and view their annual wealth statement in the same day, that's a lot of people hitting the app at the same time. That's a lot of platform events that are going to fire at the same time. Now, if our application that's subscribed via the PubSub API couldn't handle that for whatever reason, it wasn't elastic, it's going to be on AWS, it's going to be absolutely fine. But if it wasn't, we'd want to control the subscription flow because we might not be able to handle all of them events firing through all the time. So if we want to be able to batch them, we can do, because we can control the subscription flow with PubSub API, which you cannot do on streaming API. They just come through and they keep coming through and you have no control over it. Really cool thing about the PubSub API is obviously we've already talked about, you can publish to it. You can use it to publish an event back into Salesforce. Now, what that means is you actually get a publish status as well. So you know if your event has actually managed to make it to the event bus. So you can have that bit more control over error handling and all that kind of stuff. Streaming API doesn't have that capability, so there's no push status anyway. Binary versus JSON. Now, you know what a JSON payload looks like, and it can be quite chunky compared to a binary payload, and that's where your speed comes, and that's where the Apache Avro schema comes into decoding and serializing and deserializing. It makes those really big events much smaller, easier to handle with, and you can react to it without having lots of data transfer over the public internet effectively. And then finally, 4, 5, and 6 on both of these is a perfect comparison of the immediate benefit of the PubSub API. You use the PubSub API to publish events, to subscribe to events, and to get the schema for that particular event. Whereas the streaming API, to do the exact same sort of scenario, to publish, you would use either SOAP API, REST API, or Bulk API. To subscribe to events, you obviously use a streaming API, and to get the schema for those events, you use a REST API. So if you wanted to achieve the same thing the PubSub API does, you're potentially using 3 different APIs in your client to achieve the same thing. So really, then what you're thinking about is how complex your application is. Going back to the architecture side of things, how complex your architecture has to be to use the streaming API. Simply drawing out your sequence flow diagram of which system gets hit when and what APIs are hit, you could see all those different lines will get much more confusing and much more complex than if you were just using one single PubSub API. So the architecture even behind that simple aspect is much simpler, which makes it more reliable. Cool. Just check if there are any. Does the PubSub API have any same governor limits? Yes. So there are pretty much the same governor limits. There are 1 or 2 different governor limits for the PubSub API, especially when it comes to managed subscriptions, which is a beta feature. You can only have the single client on a single subscription channel, and you can only have so many clients subscribed at the same time. Allocations, PubSub API here. This is basically where you can find your different limits. This is the governor limits for the PubSub API. So you can't have more than 200 events in one publish, for example. There's a couple of other different ones worth looking at and having that bookmarked because it doesn't fall under the same governor limits page, so it's not in the same place. There's a couple of like 4 megabyte limit there, things like that. So yes, there are some governor limits that you have to bear in mind. I believe they share the same when it comes to the subscription side of things as the streaming API, but obviously they're not the same for the publish because there isn't a publish for the streaming API. So worth having that bookmarked and to hand.
Jonathan, can I ask you
Go for it.
I'm going to ask the question. If it's too off topic, let's just punt it. But we had a similar talk a couple months ago that Nadina gave, and the question came up in like 2 or 3 different forms, which was not specifically around the PubSub API, but around use cases for platform events versus use cases for like sort of like Kafka use cases, right? And when you'd use platform events versus Kafka. And I was curious if you could, I thought of it because you were talking about that your example from your work where you had devices that were, potentially that were generating platform events. And I'm curious if like during that there was any thought about, okay, are platform events the right technology for this, or should we be looking at something different?
Well, the example for myself, the mobile security policy kind of thing, Salesforce automatically publishes those events for us. Like we've not created a platform event there. That's a standard Salesforce event. Mobile, it's this one, and it's part of the real-time event monitoring stuff. And this is like a whole load of different real-time event monitoring events that are really cool and really useful to get hold of. Login events and log out events and things like that. So realistically for us, I'll leave that up if you were looking. Realistically for us, it made sense that we use that event anyway because it's already been published to the event bus. And there are a bunch of others. So not just in the real-time event monitoring, but if you look at all these different events here, these ones on the left-hand side, these are standard Salesforce platform events that take place. So that you can subscribe to yourselves as well. And I believe these will be the ones that you don't need the Shield subscription for. But like, what's a good one? I mean, there's some order ones here. I think that's more for the order management stuff. There's even where is it, prediction events and stuff like that for Einstein. they're already published to the platform. So I mean, there'd be little sense trying to rebuild that ourselves and use it ourselves. I mean, if you already, it goes back to a kind of your architectural guardrails that you have in place at your organization, and what your kind of what your governance process is and what they suggest. Because if you've got Kafka already and it's utilized by, it's subscribed to by a bunch of other systems already, then it might make more sense both commercially and architecturally to use it and not utilize what's being used on Salesforce. I mean, for us again, like we could move these events and use the Salesforce Event Relay, which publishes the events to AWS automatically for you. And that would be dead simple for us because it goes to the Event Bridge on AWS, and then we could monitor it in CloudWatch. And ultimately, that's what we're going to do. We're going to monitor it in CloudWatch, but we're not going to be using the Event Relay of Salesforce because our principles within our organization, not just for us on the Salesforce program, but all the other programs of work that are taking place in the organization, they use MuleSoft for everything. MuleSoft is the middleware that has to be used for absolutely everything because they want reusable APIs for every single feature they build. And they want to make sure it goes through system, application, and experience APIs, etc., etc. So in reality, we could have done Salesforce to AWS, dead simple. And that architecture would have been dead simple. But because the organization has the guidelines in place to always use the middleware and make it reusable, we have to go through MuleSoft. There's a couple of other things of why to use MuleSoft as well. MuleSoft, eventually, we're going to have the private connect, which means it doesn't go over the public internet. It uses AWS backbone, and we don't have to worry about sensitive data over the public internet. There's all these kind of different things that you have to think about. So Kafka, where it might be useful and it might be the thing to use in your organization, might not be in anyone else's. So it's one of those kind of yes, no, maybe every kind of
Yeah,
answer in between,
yeah, that makes sense, and those considerations make sense. Um, the question to come up if there's any sort of use cases where platform events don't make sense in Kafka does. But
Well,
this, can you would you mind dropping that link in the
yeah.
chat?
I mean, one thing that does come to mind straight away, and probably shouldn't say it, but like Salesforce platform events for starters, you only have so many of them in your allocation, and then it costs per, it's a rolling period. I got a quote from the AE the other day, and it was in the thousands for millions of events, but millions of events actually get consumed really quickly. To have a million events sounds great. I've got a million events, I don't know what to do with them. Actually, a million events on the Salesforce platform can be, if you're subscribed to that event itself, consumed so quickly. So whereas you might actually be able to fire that as a REST API to Kafka or something like that, and then allow external applications to subscribe to your Kafka stream, you might be beneficial in terms of cost at that point. So it's definitely a cost thing when it comes to Salesforce, as is most things.
Awesome, thank you.
No worries. So setting up your organization. Now, I said at the beginning, like I didn't want to obviously teach to suck eggs, so I will take 2 seconds looking at this. Now, obviously, your platform events, and I went through the standard platform events. I showed them a second ago, some of the standard platform events that you got with Salesforce that you can subscribe to. Now, if they don't, they don't satisfy your needs, you've got your real-time event monitoring objects, which there are more of that you can subscribe to, obviously, if you pay for it. But there are occasions where you might want to publish your own platform events, and that's quite simple for those of you who have never done it anyway. You create your own platform event, and it is dead simple. You create a platform event as if it's a new object, you give it the same sort of stuff, and when you've created it, you're able to then create custom fields on that platform event. Publishing platform events through Apex, publishing platform events through Flow means that you can have control over how those events work. And they're not just platform events, you can also do change data capture so that you can capture any changes made to an account or any of your custom objects, for example. So there's multiple ways that you can get events to be triggered onto the Salesforce event bus. And there's also another thing that you can think about is if you create that platform event, it's not just about Apex or Flow. You can have an external application, use the REST API, and create them too. Or in this case, the PubSub API. So it's much more accessible. A really hacky example of why you might want to create your own platform event. I've had to do it, and I've had to do it for this demo, in fact. Managed subscriptions. It's a beta feature, which I'll talk about in a moment. I'll talk about towards the end because it's not the bulk of this. It's the bit that I'm going to talk about at Dreamforce. It's a beta feature. It doesn't support all events. So the way I got around doing that is I subscribed to the event, the platform, standard platform event in an Apex trigger. That doesn't consume my platform event allocations because it's an Apex trigger on the same platform. And then I republish basically the exact same payload into a custom platform event. So then I can create a managed subscription off it because it supports all custom platform events. So I was able to get around managed subscription beta feature restriction at the moment by creating my own platform event, basically. So that's maybe a reason why you want to do it, being hacky and getting around things. So that's dead simple. Most people on here, I'm sure, know how to create platform events, know how to create change data capture, but just in case you didn't, and there's nothing wrong if you didn't know, that's how you do it in Salesforce. So actually using the PubSub API, and I'm going to pull up Postman now to have a look at this. I'm using my organization's sandbox because I've been playing around with it a lot today with the thing that I'm building at the moment. So it was a really good use case that I could actually demo today. So I thought I'd get on with it and show it today. Now, Postman shouldn't be anything new to most of you, but if it is, API application allows you to make API calls from your desktop and test out most of the, well, as you can see, a lot of different Salesforce APIs, as well as any other API you could ever want because you can create your own API request. What I'm going to show you today is how we actually utilize the PubSub API. Now, if you go to the Salesforce platform collections on Postman, go and fork the collection, you'll get access to all these wonderful pre-built APIs already. Now, what you will notice is the PubSub API doesn't form one of these directories in this collection, unfortunately. And I think that's for two reasons. One, it's not the most easiest to use because it's using a different protocol. It's using gRPC, as we know. And two, Postman doesn't allow you to save the API, the request that you make, in a collection with HTTP requests. You have to save it, annoyingly, in its own folder. So I think that's a limitation of Postman. I'm not quite sure, which makes it harder, I think, for the Salesforce devs to produce this collection and share it to us lot. So that's why it's not there at the moment. Get started with Postman. For those of you who haven't used it, fork the collection, click on the collection and go to authorization, because this is going to make your life so much easier. Scroll all the way down, click get access token, and that'll get you to log into Salesforce. And once you've logged into Salesforce, you'll be able to, and in fact, I might as well show it now anyway. But I'm going to just type in the my domain. Obviously, you'll go through the OAuth flow, allow the OAuth flow and open back up in Postman. And what that does is it gets you your access token straight away. Don't worry, I'm going to obviously revoke that access token because this is recorded. You can see my access token, but it will give you the access token and it plugs it into the variable here. So whenever you use any of these Postman APIs now for the Salesforce Platform API collection, you don't have to authenticate. It's already done for you. Makes life a lot easier. However, as I said, the gRPC PubSub APIs are not part of this collection. And you do need an access token to be able to use them. This is a dead simple, really quick, easy way to get your access token. Go and copy and paste it. So how do you use the PubSub API? First of all, click the plus, switch this.
Jonathan, just one quick question. To set that up, to access that org using the PubSub API, did you need to create a connected app or no? Just your...
Not for this. So for my demo in a second with the Python client, yes. For this with Postman, no, because it should have created an OAuth connection anyway within Salesforce. I didn't have to. You could install the connected app, I think, if you want to go into Salesforce and install it yourself and manage it. It'll automatically created.
Cool.
No worries. Yeah, so getting started with it. If you haven't used gRPC already, you probably default when you click the plus button to HTTP. You want to click that and go to gRPC, and it'll look slightly different. First of all, what you're going to want to do, it's a 3-step process for subscribing to the PubSub API. 3-step process. 1, you want to get the topic first. And the topic is your platform event or whatever it is. You need to enter api.pubsub.salesforce.com with the port number 7443. That's in the Salesforce dev docs, by the way, so you don't have to remember it. And you want to select get topic. What that's going to do is give you the option to now enter the topic name, which is event for your platform events. It could be data and the change data capture event if you're wanting to subscribe to a change data capture event. Now I want the mobile policy, enforced policy event, so I'm going to type in that. Authorization, leave it to no auth. And in metadata, what you want to do is plug in your access token. You're going to want to put your instance URL to whatever your my domain is, and then your tenant ID is going to be your org ID. And from there, that is it. You're going to hit invoke, and what you'll get now is the topic name. You knew what that was already, but what you've got, which is really important, is your schema ID. And as we've talked about already, the PubSub API is all about encoding and decoding schemas, payloads using a schema. So we're going to go ahead and grab that schema ID. Go ahead, if you've saved your request, because then what you can do is duplicate this tab, and this time you can choose get schema instead. Same metadata here, but in the message this time, rather than using topic name, we're going to plug in that schema that you've just received the schema ID for. And what that'll give you is basically the schema of the platform event on the event bus. And that's what's going to be used to, when you subscribe to platform events, that's what when you get your payload, your schema is used to decode and deserialize your event so that it's in the correct format. You know what is what the actual the event's going to be. Same again, duplicate. This time you're going to click subscribe. You can choose your number of requested, because I said you've got the amount of events you can choose with the PubSub API. So I can choose 100, I can use 1 if I wanted to. And we're using the topic name. Once I've invoked it, I'm going to click send. And as I've already said, there we go. I told you, Brian, didn't I, at the beginning, that it wouldn't work on my first go. You can, let's have a look. It'll tell me why. There's an auth error. That's because I didn't update my access token. But I should be able to, all being well. I know, still unauthenticate on I don't know. It worked earlier. You're gonna have to take my word for it.
We get the idea.
You can now, what you'll see is in this response area, you'll start seeing all of the events streaming basically, which is really cool, because what that means is now you can start in Postman watching your events. Now, this isn't an enterprise application. This isn't where you're going to now sit and have this subscribed every morning for your Salesforce platform. This isn't going to be what you need. But what this helps you do is develop, debug, test. That's where you now need to use these exact 3 same steps: get topic, get schema, and subscribe, to be able to build your actual enterprise application, or at least guide your developers in building this enterprise architecture, enterprise application, because you yourselves as enterprise architects may not be the ones building it, but you may be the ones who are guiding your developers and your dev teams to do so. Now, we'll jump into my Python client, because what we'll be able to see is pretty much the exact same setup. Now, there's a couple of differences that I will call out. For a start, And you can follow this step by step in the dev docs. They give you a hands-on, they give you the code snippets and everything to make it dead simple. You need 2 files, and these are your PubSub API, the gRPC classes. It basically tells you what you can do, all the different options that are available, getting the schema, getting the topics, publishing, for example, and the way they work and the different what am I trying to say? The different ways that they work in terms of serializing options, for example, and the way that they need to be serialized and deserialized. These 2 files are available. Where are they now? I did have it open on here. So if, for example, you're wanting to build a PubSub, a Python application like I have, you'll be able to go into the PubSub API repo, and you would want to grab the PubSub API proto definition. That proto definition using there's a command line. It's on one of the dev docs to produce these 2 files basically from the proto definition. And when you produce these 2 files from the proto definition, which was just shown you on that repo, you're then going to be using those in your application, whether it be Python, Java, whatever you're using. And they're obviously what you then use to call subscribe, call publish, call get schemas, and all that kind of stuff. Now, in this Python application, there's a couple of things I'm doing first. There's a bunch of stuff that I've done to make it nice, like asking the user for the consumer key, the connected app consumer key, their org ID, because obviously we've just seen we needed that on the Postman example. Because we're using a connected app and I'm using Jutflow, I'm going to be using a certificate. So I asked for the certificate path and the passcode to decrypt the certificate, for example. And I asked them things like what topic are they wanting to subscribe to. That's just nice stuff. You can hard code all of that into your application. You don't need to do that. It's just something nice to use. But what we actually need to be doing is the first thing, which is authentication. And you can see here, I'm using my certificate, the private key to create the JUT token payload. I'm encoding the JUT token. That's just general. That's how you do it you could do the same in Python, Node.js, Java, whatever you want to use. But what I'm going to be doing is I'm going to be using that request to authenticate through my Python application. I need to authenticate and get an access token, because that access token is what's going to be used from there on in the PubSub API. Now, when we looked at the PubSub API earlier, we talked about how the PubSub API handles authentication, and that's because it can take the access token as one of its parameters. Similar to what you saw in the Postman example there, this is the metadata that we'll be passing in to the PubSub API, exact same as what you just saw in the Postman app example. Access token, instance URL, tenant ID. And that's where we then open the connection using API pubsub salesforce.com with the 7443 port number. That, again, exactly the same as what you saw. That's the same endpoint that we're hitting. Now, whilst that's open, what we're going to be doing is, first of all, we're going to do a couple of things. We're going to open a stream. We're going to fetch a particular topic. We're going to, if we want to, submit a replay ID if we want to get from further back, if you have a replay ID. Otherwise, you can set that to none and just get either latest, which is any new platform events or change date capture events, earliest, which is all of them for the last 72 hours, or custom, which I put in place as a parameter up here. And if you pass custom using the PubSub API, that's where you would then need to give it a replay ID to get to get platform events from a particular replay onwards. As I mentioned in the deck, You can say how many you want to receive in a go. And yeah, that's you requesting the particular events from a particular event stream. You're then going to decode it, any that you receive, using the schema, the Avro schema, and you're going to obviously use the payload that you've just received. And you can do this because you will have access to the actual schema of the event. You know what event it is because you've gone and got the schema. Let's go and see where I got that from. Because I got the schema ID, which you saw again. You saw the schema ID already in the Postman example. And for all of these events, I've just simply decided I wanted to log them. You can see I'm just logging the events. At this point, all of this is just my own custom code. This is me just doing things like logging them or posting them to, well, I'm actually just logging them to the command, to the terminal, just so I can see what they are. At this point, everything you can see past here, this is where your logic goes, because you've authenticated, you've fetched the stream, you've got the schema, you've decoded the event. Now what do you want to do with it? Push it to your order management system, push it to CloudWatch, do whatever you want with it. And that's as simple as it is. That's you ready to go. Now, you could also, in the same breath, do a publish, and you wouldn't need to open a new connection. You wouldn't need to make a HTTP request to a REST API. You're good to go. You can do it right from there. What I'll do is, hopefully, if it works, I could show it working here. Maybe it's going to take a while. I have another example open. Where about that one? Which is already running. And what I did instead was I built this into, and we'll see if it actually works or not. It's still running into just a web-based client so that I could actually test it myself. So I want to show all my events. I'm going to pass in my, let's go ahead and move that a second. I want to see, I want to go ahead and get my connected app consumer key. I want to go and plug in all of the things that you might need to authenticate. Some of the things like the org ID, which you need for the actual PubSub API itself. Connected app sort of stuff. So you'll need obviously your username, PubSub API sort of stuff, where how many events do you want to receive? You're going to have to upload, if you're connecting via a connected app and using JUT, you're going to have to use a certificate. So let's go and grab a certificate. If you've encrypted it, you're going to need a passphrase. So again, that's handled in your Python. That's handled in my Python app. I'm going to want to subscribe to a particular event. So I'm going to pass into my Python. This is all still that same Python application that you saw a minute ago, but rather asking the questions in the terminal, I'm asking them in a web UI instead. I'm just built it in Flask. I want the earliest because I want all of them that is available for the last 72 hours. And I should go and hit subscribe. If this still works, hopefully I should start then seeing some events start showing up there. And this is where, again, it doesn't work because I've gone and broken the live demo by messing around earlier today. There you go. You can start seeing, there you go, my events are streaming through. And this is the sort of, you can see how fast over the last 72 hours, and I did 10 in batches of 10 there. You can now start seeing the events being received. So this is that mobile security policy one that I was doing for my example at work. Every time somebody opens the app, I can see that minimum OS version is checked, jailbroken device is checked, malware detection is checked. These are all standard Salesforce things, but I can see all that payload. And in order for my Python app to get me that raw JSON payload there, I needed to go and get the schema from the PubSub API for that particular event. I needed to I needed to get the topic, so I could get the topic ID, and I use the topic ID in the Python app to get the schema. Whenever I when I subscribe using the PubSub API to this stream, I get it in that binary format and I try and decode it. I need a schema to decode it against. That's the schema that I decode it against. And then I'm able to do whatever I want to do, which was, you saw in my Python app, I just logged it. I'm logging it here. This is where you then send it off and do whatever you want with it. So that's basically an example of me using the PubSub API now, and you can see it's just constantly listening for any other events that might happen, and it will just log them there when they come through.
Oh, I was going to say, Art asked what get schema is for, and then he said, you just answered it. It's basically to decode binary to your JSON. Is that basically it?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, yeah, so that you can have it in the same format as what the Salesforce platform is. Otherwise, you try and decode it against anything else, and it'll just be like, no, doesn't exist. Can't map that.
Yeah, good question, Art. I had the same question.
So just one thing to add, I know we're coming up to time. So what you have here is, this is the standard PubSub API. I could go and publish events, yada, yada, that's the benefit of the PubSub API. That's great. But in an enterprise application sort of example, now as an architect, what happens if my client, for whatever reason, disconnects? I've just lost that. And now I don't know what that last replay ID was. So how do I now know where to start from? Does my application, when it builds again and starts up, do I just connect and do the last 72 hours and then have to deal with the thousands or millions of duplicate events that I now have to sift through? That's not great. So as a organization now, you have to have a data store, some sort of database to store your events in, or at least the replay IDs of the last known replay ID, so that if your application does go down, you can resubscribe at the correct place. Now, that isn't great because that's a lot of hassle for you guys to have to build into your application logic. And that's where the Salesforce managed subscriptions beta feature comes into play. And that's what I'm going to be talking about on the Dreamforce event, Dreamforce session, what that actually means. Now, what Salesforce is actually going to be doing here for us is, rather than you having to take that replay event and go and store it in DynamoDB or some data store somewhere, you don't have to worry about that last known replay ID. All you have to do is send on this, because it's publish and subscribe, you have to publish a commit message to Salesforce to say, I've read that message, I've read that event, thank you. And Salesforce will store for you the last known replay ID, so that when you resubscribe, they go, it's okay, that client, they were already on that ID, give them everything afterwards. And it means that you don't have to handle that logic of storing it in a data store. Your app goes down, it rebuilds, find it in the data store, then subscribe to PubSub API from there on in the replay ID. So that's what managed subscriptions is in the PubSub sense. For Salesforce, is you just send a publish acknowledgement back, you commit the ID and say, I've read this one, commit, and they manage where you were in the process. And it makes life a lot simpler. The only thing you have to do is create, using the tooling API, a managed subscription, which is really, really easy. You just say, for this event, this platform event, I want to create something, and you name it whatever you want to name it, this managed subscription. Then in the PubSub API, using slightly different functions, you use a managed subscribe rather than just the fetch. You subscribe to this instead rather than the platform event, and you're good to go. So that's the real benefit of now, even more so PubSub API on top of streaming API. Because again, with the streaming API and your Comet D applications, you'd have to do the same as what you kind of have to do now with the PubSub API. You have to manage those replay events. PubSub API going forward, managed subscriptions, takes away that hassle. You don't even have to think about it.
That's awesome. Jonathan, that's one of the big challenges of sort of the PubSub model, is how you handle if your application drops and where do you pick it up. So,
Exactly. And it's a nightmare to have to deal with. You have to think of storage. You have to think of, I mean, if your client goes down as well, your application goes down, it's the same application that's going to be making the store of the replay ID. So there's a good chance if your application goes down, it one didn't capture and store the last replay ID anyway. So you're probably going to be getting duplicate events no matter where you look at it, because it's not going to be the most recent one that you received.
hmm, awesome. This
Welcome
presentation
times
has
though.
been this presentation has been fantastic. We've got 0 minutes left. But
Sorry.
no, this was awesome. Thank you so much. And judging by the thank yous in the comments, I think everybody dug it. Before we drop, Jonathan, any sort of parting words or?
Yeah, one quick thing what I'll say is, and it's more to you, Brian, to give to the rest of the group. What I will give is a bunch of links and resources to the blogs, to the how-to steps, and I've also got a GitHub repository that I've created this week, which I've made public, that you can use to subscribe using Python, and play around with the platform, PubSub API anyway. So I'll give access to that too.
Awesome. Thank you. Yeah, and we'll publish, like I mentioned, no pun intended. We'll be publishing the recording to this on our YouTube channel, and I'll put those in the show notes, and we'll distribute it around to everybody who signed up. So awesome. Thank you so much, Jonathan.
No, thank you for having me. I appreciate it. Sorry for going over time.
No, it's fantastic. And thanks everybody for joining today, and we'll talk to you all soon.
Cheers. Thank you.
Thanks, Jonathan.